the Kickapoo was a unique vessel. She was built in 1921, and she was altered in 1926. What the Coast Guard did was to increase the length of the vessel and cut back the very bottom part of her bow, which is called the forefoot. And this particular design feature allows her to ride up over the ice and use the weight of the vessel to break the ice. This is a very important advance in icebreaker technology because it is really a design feature that allows the vessel not only to push its way through ice, but actually to break ice.
The Northland, commissioned in 1927, replaced the Bear in the waters off Alaska. Despite having sails for emergency use, the Northland incorporated the latest design features, as well as a new power plant, the recently developed diesel engine. The United States was now producing strong and powerful ice-breaking ships, but their ability and importance would not be immediately recognized. As is often the case, the technology would have to wait for the world to catch up. After serving over 20 years as an icebreaker, the 216-foot cutter Northland was sold to the Israeli Navy. The U.S. Coast Guard still ran the Bering Sea patrols with turn-of-the-century ships. There seemed no reason for the newer, more costly vessels. But that would soon change.
In the 1930s, several things happened that required the Coast Guard to begin icebreaking. The first major thing that happens is that in the Northeast, people start heating their homes with fuel oil. Before this time, they had been heating it with coal, and coal was brought by rail. But heating oil was brought by barges up the rivers.
The shift in consumer habits prompted a second major change. In 1936, President Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Coast Guard into the icebreaking business.
The 1936 executive order by President Roosevelt that stated that the Coast Guard should try to keep the navigable waters open during winter months basically caught the Coast Guard unprepared.
Their turn-of-the-century fleet would no longer suffice. The Coast Guard began an intensive study of icebreaker technology. Leading the research was Lieutenant Edward Thiel, who immediately turned to European designers for help. Because harsh Scandinavian winters would freeze harbors solid, countries such as Denmark and Sweden built some of the best icebreakers in the world. Thiel found that many of the European ships utilized bow propellers to clear the way in front of them, while powerful diesel-electric engines battered the unrelenting ice.
When he was over in Europe and looking at the icebreakers of the northern European countries, one of the things that Thiel realized was that some of the technology was already in use in the United States in other vessels. For example, the bow thrusters were being used on Great Lakes car ferries. What he was surprised is that nobody had put all of this technology together to create or to build an icebreaker.
The culmination of Thiel's efforts was the 110-foot Raritan-class icebreaker Tugs. 4 of these vessels would be built in 1939. Their relatively short length allowed the ships to follow the winding leads and cracks in the ice, but they still had plenty of power to punch through when necessary. But Thiel's greatest contribution to icebreakers would come as the world spiraled into war. With the outbreak of World War II, the icebreaker's reach would become global. A new breed of ship would become vital in the frozen North Atlantic. To remain for long periods of time in ice fields above the polar circle, these ships needed to be both phenomenally strong and large enough to carry the necessary supplies. The 269-foot Wind-class icebreakers were contracted in November of 1941. Some of the world's first true polar icebreakers, the ships were strengthened by their close spacing of internal frames and carefully designed trusses. Combined with the 1 5/8-inch welded steel hull plating, these ships could resist 3,000 pounds of pressure per square inch along the waterline.
at the beginning of the war. We based our designs on the breakers that they had in Europe. They were much smaller icebreakers, and about 75% of them had a bow screw. We figured that the Europeans never left the fjords over there because as soon as we went into hard Arctic ice, we broke screws. And consequently, they were built that way, but we took them off within a couple of years.
Once they were redesigned, the wind-class breakers became the best the world had ever seen. So good that none fought for the U.S.
The north wind, the south wind, and the west wind were loaned to the Russians for the duration of the war to help keep their ports open, which were very important for supplying the Russian war machine.
But there were other fronts. With its best ice-breaking ship serving in Russian waters, the United States called to help in the strategically important waters of the North Atlantic. These ships, as well as others, would form the Greenland Patrol.
The United States was the Greenland theater of operations. Many people don't realize how important that was. Greenland was being used by the Germans to predict the weather of the European theater. They were sending weather teams there to send out the weather reports. The other strategic need for Greenland was the cryolite mines. Now, cryolite is a very important mineral that is used in the production of aluminum.
Throughout the war, the ships and crews of the Greenland Patrol would attack and destroy German fortifications, thwarting their enemies' best efforts to acquire vital information and resources.